A recent report about the train derailment in Ohio that resulted in all these toxic chemicals being released into the environment and has so far killed thousands of fish has just shown that the color of the water in the Ohio River has changed. This is another concerning signal about the potential environmental and safety fallout of this incident. And this is the kind of incident, I imagine, that could be used to justify a climate emergency.
And how much would that look like the COVID emergency we're still living under? Well, let's look at the facts.
I'm Brendan Fallon.
And I'm Lee Smith.
And we're over the target. In terms of the fallout of the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, one of the most concerning things we're seeing is these symptoms that people are talking about, where they're getting rashes, they're finding blood in their stool, they're vomiting. The concerning thing is that we don't know what this could lead to. We're seeing these initial signs, but we don't know what the longer-term health effects could be. We don't know what the longer-term effects on the environment could be. And these symptoms are linked largely to the industrial chemicals that have been leaked or intentionally released because of this train derailment. And in the face of a hazard like this, it's understandable that there would be calls for some kind of drastic action to be taken to prevent something like this happening again in the future.
Right. We've also seen indications, I believe, that the fallout from the derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, may be spreading to other parts of the country. So, of course, this is of great concern. It's clearly a humanitarian disaster, an environmental disaster as well. If soil and water have been poisoned, and if people, American citizens, are suffering from this, this is clearly a disaster. And as ghoulish as it is, it would hardly be surprising to see our government, both the federal government and state governments, use this horrible crisis to take advantage of the situation and to turn it into a climate emergency. We have to remember this is precisely what happened with COVID. Right? We saw people getting extremely sick. They turned this into an emergency and started acquiring different powers on this account.
Yeah, I think if we want to look at the COVID emergency as a point of reference for this, President Trump declared a national emergency in early 2020, I believe. Following this, we had state governments, federal government declaring public health emergencies, also the World Health Organization. In terms of a climate emergency, as a point of reference, we have a statement from the Center for Biological Diversity, and they've actually called on the Biden administration to take the following actions: to ban crude oil exports, to stop oil and gas drilling on the outer continental shelf, and to curtail international trade and investment. This would have no small impact on America's economy. And this is just looking at the economic side, disregarding the kind of social impacts that we saw with the COVID lockdowns.
And with the climate lockdown, they would clearly target fossil fuel energy and a whole bunch of other things. The larger picture, I think we have a pretty good idea of what emergency, what a climate emergency would look like. We saw it under COVID-19, and people are still shocked by it. Closing down schools, closing down churches, restaurants shut down, people staying home. An emergency situation means the situation is not normal. What happens then? Abnormal people rise to the fore with their abnormal desires for power and all sorts of things. I think a perfect illustration of this is, I'm sure most of our viewers will remember the video of a police boat chasing down a paddleboarder off of a Malibu beach. It's absolutely nuts. And we're likely to see something like that again happen under emergency powers.
We saw a really concerning array of actions taken, not just in America or across the world. Australia is off note with the quarantine camps they set up and putting people into quarantine camps who weren't vaccinated because they apparently represented such a grave risk. Mariana Mazzucato chairs an economics council for the WHO, and she's indicated that a climate lockdown may be necessary and the kinds of restrictions that might entail. For example, limiting private vehicle use, banning the consumption of red meat, and imposing extreme energy-saving measures. So, just the idea of people not being able to use their cars, this is heavily restrictive and very limiting of people's freedom of movement.
And the kind of nutty ideas that would be implemented. We have to stop eating red meat. People would not be able to drive their cars. Those are precisely the kind of measures that lunatics would impose on the United States again, as we saw the fanatical, insane measures imposed on Americans during the COVID lockdowns. Remember, these things give power not only to the federal government and state governments and local governments, they also empower fanatics. And that's part of what would happen here.
And it's not just us, Lee, who are making the comparison between the COVID emergency and a potential climate emergency. We know that Barack Obama in 2020 tweeted basically suggesting that we've had the COVID emergency and maybe in the future even harsher measures may be needed in a climate emergency scenario.
Yeah, this has been part of the Democratic Party wish list for quite a while. I mean, we know that the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016 talked about her imposing a climate emergency when she took office. Thankfully, she didn't take office, and have a chance to impose a climate emergency. Unfortunately, Donald Trump did call for a COVID emergency. And we can certainly see that as a dry run. I think that if Donald Trump were president again, he may do it all. He would have done it differently. But we can certainly see what happened, that this may be considered a dry run for a climate emergency. They've already seen the different levers they need to pull and what they can get away with. So again, this is certainly something, if it's not going to be initiated, and we hope it's not going to be initiated by the derailment in Ohio, we can be quite certain that they're looking for opportunities. Why? Again, because the senior Democratic Party officials have been talking about this for several years. Share over the target episodes with your family and friends, and also share your other favorite Epoch TV shows, like Brendan Fallon's Vital Signs.
You can follow me on Instagram on see.vital signs to find out about new episodes on that show. I think it's easy to see how Obama, how Hillary Clinton have been able to appeal to many voters' sentiment about the environment, because many people are really concerned about this. This would appeal to many people. As a child, I believed that we had to basically shut down civilization. This was from the education I was getting as a child 40 years ago, 35 years ago. That was the answer. We had to, stop cars and collapse civilization, and that would see us through to the future. The point is that what's being suggested, the kind of solutions that are being suggested, won't necessarily help the environment. One good example of this is the movement in Nevada protesting against a major lithium mine where they're going to be getting lithium for lithium batteries.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who are writing about this, the problems with the renewable energy infrastructure. It's not good for the environment. The idea that rare earth minerals are going to be pulled from the ground, it's going to affect the soil, it's going to affect the water. I mean, frankly, what it looks like the environmental disaster that's been caused by the train derailing in Ohio. So that's what the clean energy industry is, replicating that disaster not only in the United States, but around the world, including Africa, where we know that child slaves are employed to pull rare earth minerals out of the ground. What you were talking about before, Brendan, talking about that this is what you were taught as a child, this is still what's going on. It's a millenarian message. And this is who Barack Obama was. The world is coming to an end. And if we don't do something about it now, if we don't overturn the universe, the next generation won't live to see it. Well, how many generations are we going to keep getting that message? Right? What they're doing is they're taking advantage of people, many of them weak people and actually children, by frightening them. But this is only the larger messaging operation, because there's something else going on behind the scenes here that's apart from what they're saying about the clean energy industry.
This worries children, it depresses children. They're led to believe that the world is going to end, and it's a tough burden to carry as a child. I carry that to some degree. I think the pressure is even stronger now. And the point you're making is, what is the motivation behind this? Are they really about saving the environment? And getting back to the example that I mentioned before, what's happening in Nevada, where we have a small environmental group called Protect Thacker Pass. They're protesting against a lithium mine in Nevada. Their concern is that in the event that a climate emergency is declared, this will kind of take the reins and the restrictions off what kind of mining can be done in the name of a climate emergency, in the name of of protecting the environment, developing things like green infrastructure, so they could potentially streamline federal financing to these kinds of projects like lithium mining, and they may not be susceptible to the kind of environmental review and compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act that the current mining organizations have to comply with.
Good on the environmentalists underscoring the lies at the heart of the green energy, the renewable energy industry. We have a very clear idea now. It's not just that Barack Obama owns 2 pieces of beachfront property, that there's something wrong with the way the Democratic Party has been talking about climate change. We also looked, as we said before, at the different studies, the very thorough research showing the kind of damage that building and creating climate change infrastructure would actually cause the environment. So what's really going on here? And I think we can get an understanding or some insight if we look at what really happened during the COVID emergency. To what extent was that really about stopping a pandemic?
I think the answer to that question, Lee, what were the purposes of the measures taken during the pandemic, like the lockdowns and the various restrictions imposed on people in the name of safety? I think the answer to the point of those could be found in looking at their effectiveness. Just looking at the lockdowns, we know that children missed a lot of school. They were forced to stay home. This has had a significant impact on children's education level, their ability in English and mathematics. That's not to mention the kinds of mental health fallout we've seen from locking people down for that period of time. That's just looking at lockdowns. I'm sure you have other examples of the effectiveness of these measures.
Well, I mean, we know there was a study. The first study came out from Johns Hopkins showing that the lockdowns had absolutely no effect stopping the course of the pandemic. We know also there are plenty of studies showing that masks are absolutely ineffective against stopping a respiratory virus. It makes me laugh even to say that sentence. It's so preposterous. And now we have, as we've discussed, from Anthony Fauci himself saying that the vaccines were ineffective. So it looks like if the purpose of the lockdowns and the emergency measures were to stop the spread of a pandemic, it's an absolute failure. In fact, it's a total disaster for the country. Except we do have hard numbers on something else, where the effects of the lockdowns proved immensely profitable for another class of people.
We've certainly seen signs that a climate emergency could be very profitable for certain factions of society. And I'm sure we saw that reflected with the COVID lockdowns or the COVID safety measures that were taken.
Absolutely. Speaking specifically about the United States, a tremendous amount of wealth transferred from the American middle class to the oligarchies. How many billionaires got richer, right? We can talk about Jeff Bezos, we can talk about Mark Zuckerberg, right? Again, the amount of money that people made from the lockdowns, it's profound. And I think that is precisely what we'd be looking at with a climate emergency as well. It would be another instrument for the political establishment to transfer wealth to the corporate establishment, especially that part of the establishment that turns out to donate lots of money to the Democratic Party.
And this transfer of wealth wouldn't necessarily just be taking place within the United States. We know that a lot of the material for the green infrastructure comes from China, things like solar panels, lithium batteries. And there's a really startling paradox of hypocrisy here, because we know the kind of conditions that workers are subject to, very inhumane conditions in Chinese factories where these kinds of things are manufactured. And getting back to your point earlier about the conditions in some of these mines, we have lithium mines in places in Africa that are run by the Chinese Communist Party. And we're getting reports of shocking human rights abuses coming through from mines operated by the Chinese Communist Party. So we have this transfer of wealth to the Chinese Communist Party, which remains one of the largest, if not the largest, polluters on the planet.
You're right. That's what we saw with the COVID lockdowns too. The amount of money that was transferred to a slave state, which is the People's Republic of China. We see it augmenting the bonds of slavery in Africa as well. And what happens here in the United States as money is transferred away from the middle class and into the purses of the oligarchy? They're building a slave state here as well. They're increasing the gap between the oligarchy and the middle class to impoverish the middle class. That would be the point of the climate emergency, just as it's the purpose of the climate change agenda. Just as this is what Joe Biden and the Democratic Party have been pushing for years, and that Biden has been implementing bit by bit. A climate emergency would give them the opportunity to shove that down the throats of the Americans and again, transfer wealth away from working Americans, middle-class Americans, into the hands of the oligarchy. And as you perfectly pointed out, into the treasure chest of the Chinese Communist Party.
It's a strong point, Lee. The disregard for their safety really comes through in the kinds of policies that were implemented during the COVID emergency and what's being proposed for a climate emergency. And with what's happened in Ohio, a really horrific situation where people can't go back to their homes. They're manifesting some very frightening symptoms. Their skin rashes, vomiting. You don't know where this is going to lead. We don't know what kind of health effects they're going to suffer and how badly this is going to damage the environment. All the money that goes into furthering green infrastructure, where's the money that could have gone to preventing derailments or setting up safety signals so that there's better steps, there's better measures in place to prevent this kind of thing from happening? I'm sure in comparison to the green infrastructure cost, it would be fairly minuscule. But once again, we see these kinds of considerations going by the wayside in the name of another agenda.
One of the advantages we have now, Brendan, in comparing the COVID emergencies to the possible or the climate emergencies desired by large parts of the Democratic Party is we know what it looks like. We know what happened. The question is now, will Americans stand for their rights? We know what they're doing. We know what the program is about. Will Americans stand? We must.
The writing on the wall is certainly getting clearer and clearer, Lee. I'm Brendan Fallon.
And I'm Lee Smith.
And we're over the target.